Richard Hale had lived on the same suburban street for more than a decade, and for most of that time, his neighbors saw him as the picture of stability. He was a police officer with a firm handshake, a man who waved while mowing his lawn, and the kind of figure people pointed to as an example of safety in their community. To strangers, he seemed dependable and almost boring in his predictability. But under the neatly trimmed hedges and polite smiles, Hale carried something far darker, a mixture of arrogance, prejudice, and a hunger for control that he carefully disguised behind his badge. The suburb itself reflected a sense of quiet perfection. Rows of nearly identical houses lined clean streets, each with driveways that held polished cars and basketball hoops. It was the kind of neighborhood where families let their children ride bikes until dusk without worry. Nothing about the place suggested violence or scandal. It was a stage dressed in normalcy, and that made what was coming even harder to believe. Behind curtains and closed doors, Richard Hale was building a secret life that contradicted everything people thought they knew about him. To the public, Hale was a man who respected order. He showed up to community events in uniform, attended barbecues with his wife and children, and played the role of a good neighbor convincingly. But beneath the uniform, there were cracks. His private conversations were laced with bitterness toward people who didn't look like him, his prejudices hidden just well enough to avoid suspicion. He carried a quiet resentment for the way the world was changing, a resentment that burned stronger with every passing year. Most never noticed, but those who had spent more time with him often walked away with a vague discomfort, a sense that something in his smile never quite reached his eyes. When Maya Thompson moved into the house next door, Hale's attention shifted immediately. She was 23, full of energy, and determined to make something of herself. Neighbors admired her independence, noting how hard she worked to juggle jobs and studies. Hale, however, saw her differently. At first, he masked his interest as neighborly concern, offering help when she moved in and making small gestures that seemed harmless. But those gestures carried intent. He studied her routines, noting when she left for work and when she returned. What others might dismiss as friendliness was, in truth, the first steps of an obsession. Hale's life was built on maintaining appearances, and his badge gave him a shield of authority. People trusted him without question, rarely thinking he might be capable of deception. That trust became his weapon. Behind the facade of the polite officer next door, he nurtured thoughts he would never dare say out loud. He found himself drawn to Maya in a way that unsettled even him, though he refused to admit it. The attraction was mixed with the darker parts of his nature, turning into something possessive. On the surface, everything looked normal. A respected cop, a young neighbor chasing her dreams, and a peaceful street with nothing more dramatic than the occasional yard sale. But the story was already shifting. The moment Maya unpacked her boxes and settled into her new home, the balance of the neighborhood began to tilt. The life Richard Hale had built so carefully was about to fracture, and beneath the cracks, his true self was waiting to emerge. Maya Thompson had arrived in the suburb with quiet determination. She was young, but carried herself with a confidence that came from years of working harder than most her age. At 23, she juggled 2 jobs, one at a coffee shop and another at a small clothing store, while studying part-time at a local college. Her dream was simple yet powerful, to build a life of independence, far removed from the struggles of her past. The new neighborhood promised peace, safety, and a chance to focus on her future. For a while, it seemed like she had found exactly what she was searching for. Richard Hale was quick to step into that world. He noticed her moving in and made sure to be the first neighbor to welcome her. With his uniform and polished image, his presence carried authority. To Maya, he appeared like a friendly older neighbor, someone who could offer guidance or protection in a new environment. Hale leaned on that perception. He offered small gestures, a smile when she came home late, help with carrying groceries, advice on keeping her car secure. These gestures made him seem trustworthy, but beneath them was a desire he refused to control. What began as neighborly exchanges soon grew into secret encounters. Hale found excuses to visit, choosing late hours when his wife and children slept. He always insisted on discretion, warning Maya that people would not understand if they saw them together. The secrecy gave the relationship a dangerous edge. For Maya, it was confusing. She was flattered by the attention, but unsettled by the circumstances. Hale was older, married, and a police officer. The balance of power between them was never equal, and the secrecy only deepened that imbalance. At first, Maya convinced herself that she was in control. She accepted his help with bills, the gifts he occasionally left at her doorstep, and the attention he lavished on her. But over time, she began to see the cracks in his mask. Hale's affection was not tender but possessive. He wanted to know where she was, who she was with, and how she spent her free time. His questions carried the weight of interrogation rather than care. Maya felt increasingly trapped, but she feared what might happen if she tried to end things abruptly. Hale, on the other hand, grew more obsessive. The affair fed his need for control. In his mind, Maya was not just a neighbor or a secret companion, she was something that belonged to him. The fact that their relationship was hidden from the world seemed to fuel his obsession even further. He relished the dual life he was living, respected officer by day, secret lover by night. He convinced himself that no one would ever suspect him, that his uniform and reputation would protect him from scrutiny. Maya began noticing how he lingered around her house even when she had not invited him. His patrol car sometimes appeared parked down the street for no clear reason. She brushed it off at first, telling herself he was simply watching out for her, but deep down she knew it was more than that. The boundaries were eroding. The secrecy that had once shielded her was now a cage. The hidden affair had become a dangerous trap. What began with curiosity and charm was now turning into something much darker, something Maya feared she could not escape without consequence. The suburb that once felt safe was now filled with shadows, and at the center of them stood the man who had convinced her he was there to protect her. The cracks in Richard, Hale's carefully constructed life widened when he learned that Maya Thompson had started spending time with someone else. It began with subtle signs, her staying out later than usual, laughter that carried down the street when a young man dropped her off, the brightness in her expression that he had not seen in weeks. To Hale, this was not a natural progression of Maya's life, but a personal betrayal. His control over her was slipping, and that loss sent him into a spiral of jealousy he could no longer contain. The man Maya had begun seeing was her co-worker, someone close to her age who treated her with the respect she deserved. Their connection was light and genuine, the kind of relationship she had always wanted, simple, without the heavy weight of secrecy or fear. But for Hale, the very idea of Maya being with someone else ignited a rage he could not mask. To him, it was not just about romance. It was about power. He had built a narrative in his head that Maya belonged to him, and anyone threatening that illusion became an enemy. Hale's jealousy quickly transformed into obsession. He used his position as a police officer to monitor Maya in ways no one else could. He checked license plates, learned the identity of her new partner, and began driving past her workplace under the guise of routine patrol. The authority he carried by wearing a uniform gave him access that others did not question, but every action was motivated by his growing paranoia. Neighbors began to notice how often his patrol car idled near Maya's house, sometimes for hours at night, but few dared to question it. After all, he was an officer, and officers were trusted to keep the community safe. Maya felt the shift. She noticed the way his questions became sharper, the way he demanded to know where she was going and who she was meeting. What had once been subtle hints of control now revealed themselves as full-blown surveillance. She confided to a close friend, admitting that she no longer felt safe. She worried about what might happen if she tried to break free completely. The fear grew each time she saw his car at the end of the street, headlights dimmed, engine running. Hale's obsession eroded any logic he once had. At home, he became distant, hiding behind a wall of lies to his wife and children. He convinced himself that no one could see through the facade, yet his behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. His nights were consumed by thoughts of Maya and the man who had stolen her. Each time he saw them together, even in the most innocent of moments, it fueled his rage further. The community continued its daily rhythm, children playing, sprinklers hissing, neighbors exchanging greetings. But beneath that surface, tension was building. Hale was no longer satisfied with secrecy. He was preparing for confrontation. In his mind, the story could only end one way, with him regaining control. For Maya, the walls were closing in. She was caught between the hope of building a life with someone who truly cared for her and the looming shadow of a man whose jealousy had turned into something dangerously unpredictable. The summer evening began like any other in the quiet suburb. The air was heavy with heat, and the street was alive with the faint sounds of sprinklers clicking and insects humming. But behind the ordinary rhythm of the neighborhood, a storm was brewing. Richard Hale had been watching Maya for days, his anger growing with every glimpse of her new partner. By the time he saw them together that night, walking up to her driveway with easy laughter, his rage had become uncontrollable. The mask of the polite officer slipped completely, replaced by the twisted obsession that had been festering for months. He parked his car just down the street, waiting for the right moment. To anyone else, it looked like an officer on a late patrol, but inside the vehicle, Hale was seething. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he watched Maya say goodbye to her partner. Every second of their interaction burned into his mind, fueling the conviction that she had betrayed him. He convinced himself that she had humiliated him, that she had made a fool of the authority he thought he carried over her. The thought circled in his head until there was no space left for reason. When her partner drove away, Hale moved. He stepped out of the car, his figure blending into the shadows, and approached Maya as she reached her driveway. She didn't expect him to be there. The confrontation began with his anger spilling out in gestures, his presence looming and unshakable. Neighbors later said they heard a sharp exchange of voices, though the words were muffled by distance and the closed doors of summer air-conditioned homes. What they heard was the sound of a man losing control and a young woman trying to escape the tightening grip of his obsession. The tension escalated quickly. Maya attempted to back away, but Hale's fury pushed him forward. His authority as a police officer had always been his shield, but now it became his weapon. The confrontation turned violent in a matter of seconds, and the quiet street was shattered by the struggle. A scream pierced the night, echoing through the rows of houses, but no one reacted fast enough. By the time the sound faded, silence had returned, an eerie, heavy silence that carried the weight of something irreversible. Maya's body was left crumpled on the driveway, her life stolen in the span of moments. The scene was a chilling contradiction. A young woman full of promise lying still under the suburban streetlights, her future cut short in the very place she had hoped to build a new life. Hale stood over her, the reality of what he had done sinking in too late. The rage that had fueled him drained away, leaving only the cold recognition of the crime he could not undo. It didn't take long for the evidence to point directly to him. His fingerprints were everywhere, his weapon was tied to the act, and his presence had been witnessed. The man who had once been trusted to uphold the law had crossed into the darkest of betrayals. That night, the perfect image of the quiet suburban street cracked wide open, revealing the horror that had been lurking just beneath its surface. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence the day Richard Hale stood trial. The man who had once worn a uniform with pride was now dressed in a plain prison jumpsuit, his posture hunched, his eyes darting nervously from the jury to the floor. For years, he had been a symbol of authority in his community, someone people trusted without question. Now, he was the accused in a brutal murder, his reputation shattered beyond repair. The mask he had worn for so long had been ripped away, leaving only the truth of what he had done to Maya Thompson. The prosecution laid out the case with precision. They described the secret affair, the obsession, and the rage that consumed Hale when Maya tried to move on with her life. Witnesses testified to the nights they had seen his patrol car parked near her home for no apparent reason. Forensic experts pointed to the overwhelming evidence, his fingerprints on the scene, the weapon tied directly to him, and the timeline that left little room for doubt. Piece by piece, the image of a respected officer was replaced with the portrait of a predator who had used his authority as cover for his crimes. Maya's family sat in the courtroom, their grief etched into every expression. They listened as her life was dissected in testimony, from her ambition to her final moments. The promise of her future, the dreams she had spoken about so often, were laid beside the details of her violent death. For them, the trial was not just about justice, but about ensuring her story was not forgotten. Every detail, no matter how painful, had to be heard. Hale's defense tried to paint him as a man pushed to the edge, suggesting he had been caught in a moment of weakness. But the evidence was far too strong, and the jury saw through the attempt to minimize his actions. They saw the pattern of control, the secrecy of the affair, and the calculated way he had stalked Maya before the deadly confrontation. The verdict, when it came, was swift, guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentencing was equally decisive. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Hale showed little reaction, his face a mask of emptiness. Perhaps he understood that his life as he knew it was over, or perhaps he refused to accept the weight of his actions. Either way, he was led away in shackles, no longer the man neighbors had once waved to across their manicured lawns. For the community, the aftermath was jarring. They struggled to reconcile the image of the officer who had once attended their barbecues and helped their children cross the street with the reality of the murderer who had lived among them. The quiet suburb that had seemed so safe now carried a shadow. The house next to Maya's stood as a reminder of what had been lost, a silent witness to the violence that had unfolded. For Maya's family, the sentence brought some measure of justice, but not peace. They would never see her graduate, never watch her achieve the goals she had worked so hard for. Her story became a warning, a chilling reminder that danger sometimes wears the face of those trusted most. Richard Hale's downfall exposed not only the darkness within one man, but also the fragile illusion of safety that can hide terrible secrets. The street would never be the same again, haunted forever by the tragedy that revealed the truth behind the mask.